Start.
You
Okay.
ready?
We're right on the time.
Okay. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us from. Welcome to this month episode of Diaspora Dialogues, our monthly podcast, where we bring to you topical issues and dissect them and have guests, experts to help us understand them and also to take questions and contributions from you, our audience. Um, this month's edition focuses on the topic of African Americans' relations with Africa and with Africans. And we are honored to be joined by an expert, I would say a world-renowned expert on the subject, by the name of Professor Nemata Blyden. Professor Blyden is the Armstead Robinson Professor of African American History at the University of Virginia. And she is the author of the acclaimed book, African Americans and Africa, A New History. This book is one that I cherish so much. And I was telling Professor Blyden when I invited her to join us that I've just proposed a course that I'll be teaching, I believe, this coming fall on this very topic. And her book will be the main text in the course. When we advertise, it will also interest Professor Blyden to know that when we advertise this show on Facebook, a couple of people excitedly replied that they had purchased your book when it came out, and it was one of the most insightful books they had read on this topic. So I just thought that I should mention that because we, authors, we like to hear those kinds of but in this particular case, we really have an authority and an expert on this field, so we are honored to have her. Um, she is a widely published scholar, well renowned. She's giving talks on various aspects of this topic at various places and institutions. She has a busy schedule, so we don't take her presence here lightly, and we hope that everyone who has joined us will benefit from her insights as she delves into this issue. I should make, if in case you are wondering about her last name, Blyden, for some of you who have read the history, philosophies of West Africa in particular, yes, it's that Blyden that you were thinking about. She is the great granddaughter of Edward Wilmot Blyden, the famous, legendary African American and diaspora Caribbean scholar, intellectual, philosopher who moved to Liberia and then Sierra Leone and settled there. She's a descendant, and so she's, as Osmund and I, my co-host and I, were saying just before we started the show. If there's anyone, there's no one. We can't imagine anyone that's more qualified because she has African American roots, I believe, on her maternal side, and then on her paternal side, you have the Blyden. She carries the Blyden name. Not only that, she just let us know that she actually grew up in part in Nsukka in eastern Nigeria, where her father, the grandson of Edward Blyden, was a professor. So she covers all of the facets of the diaspora experience, of the African experience, the African American experience. So we are truly, truly grateful that we have somebody who embodies this topic, but also writes about it from an informed and scholarly perspective. What we're going to do, I would like to just do a quick run through of some of the issues that we want to touch on. And I should say that I should confess, rather, that some of these issues I did a bit of cheating by reading her book, going back to her book, and flipping through, even though I had read it already, but I just had to go back to make sure that I look at what she's covered in the book, chapter to chapter. So, but I do think that her book actually gives us a very good template for this show, to be honest, because all of the issues that we want to touch on, she has written about in this book. So this book, it basically covers the complex engagement of African Americans with Africa from the mid 19th century to the present. So the chronological sweep is vast, and the issues that she covers and the periods and the events cover a wide range of issues: the immigration movement, the back to Africa movement in African American communities, the period of Pan-Africanism, the period of anti-colonial movements and civil rights and the independence movement, all the way to the anti-apartheid movement and struggle, the Cold War, and post-colonial, events in Africa after independence. So she looks at how African Americans have engaged with Africa throughout these periods and how they imagined Africa, how they engage with the continent. She also looks at this foundational question of what Africa means to African Americans. That's basically the premise of the book, if I understand it correctly. What does Africa mean? What did it mean back then to African Americans, and what does it mean to them now? And this is a very good place to begin, I would say. Um, but I would be remiss if I didn't touch on the book's epilogue, because that's for me, that brings it to the contemporary period. If you read the book's epilogue, it talks about the phenomenal growth in the population of African immigrants in the United States, right, in the 20th century, but also into the 21st century. This growth of the African immigrant population in the US has brought forth all kinds of debates, for instance, and she touches on this in the epilogue of the book, debates about, for instance, who is qualified to use the term African American. As an immigrant in the US, African immigrant, do I get to use that term? Should I use it? What about my kids? Can my kids call themselves African Americans? And if they do, is it appropriate? Does it honor the long history of enslaved people in this country and so on and so forth? So she touches on some of these contentious issues as well. Um, and then, I would, I added a few things that we will touch on, but I'll save those. But what I want to start with, I want to start with a question, Professor Blyden. In terms of this fundamental question of what Africa means to African Americans,
Mm-hmm.
how, with your vast scholarly experience, but also your own personal experiences growing up on both sides and visiting both sides and having families on both sides, what would you say is the most dominant frame in which African Americans have related to Africa? What kind of what dominant meanings have they attached to Africa from the period that your study begins to the present?
So can you hear me? I put my headphones on because I couldn't hear you quite so well. So can you all hear me?
Yes,
Okay,
very, very
excellent.
well. Yes.
Yeah. So the way I guess I would answer that question is because it's a complex question, and for every African American you would ask that question, right? The answer would be different. And I think that's in large part why I was interested in exploring that question, right? Because for many, Africa means nothing, right? But for others, Africa plays a central role in how they conceptualize their identity as Americans, right? And so part of what I think I was trying to say is that when you look at this long history of the ways in which African Americans engaged with the continent, you see a variety of ways in which people think about Africa or think about their relationship to Africa. But having said that, I think I would also argue that even for those who say, "Oh, I'm not African. Africa means nothing to me," they're engaging with it in some way, right? They're recognizing it as part of their history, even as they say it's no longer, it's no longer me. I'm no longer interested in engaging with this place. So this is the interesting thing that I think I found most that I thought was the most interesting thing was the ways in which even when people were saying, I'm not African, they were engaging with the continent in some way. So I think that's how I would answer that question.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Fantastic. I should also say something that I forgot to say in my intro is that Black History Month, February was Black History Month in the United
Yes.
States, and it ended yesterday.
Yesterday.
And so this episode of our show commemorates Black History Month.
Yes.
So we're trying to engage with the African diaspora. But I wanted to also piggyback on that question before I turn it over to my co-hosts. There's a portion of your book that looks at concrete, practical engagement with Africa. There's another aspect that deals with imagined connections, imaginations of Africa, how African Americans construct ideas about Africa, right? And build all kinds of tropes about Africa, even for many who would never visit the continent. So there's a productive relationship between the two, the practical and the imaginary. But there's also a tension there. So which one is more interesting to you as a scholar? Is it the practical engagement, and how do they relate? Is what I'm trying to get at.
So, this book came out of a class that I taught for many years. So it's, it's fitting that people are using it to teach a class because the book began as a class that I taught. And I think I would like to share, because I don't know if I'll get a chance anywhere else to tell you how I came to what eventually became this book. I used to live in Texas, in Dallas, Texas in the 1990s. And I guess it would have been maybe around 1994. There was an article in the Dallas Morning News about a Black couple in one of the suburbs of Dallas who had woken up, and it just said it was a Black family. I don't know where they were from, nothing about them, but it said they woke up in the morning and somebody had spray painted "Go Back to Africa" on their garage. And when I read that article, I thought to myself, well, where were these people expected to go? These people who had lived here for centuries, whose ancestors had been enslaved, their blood, sweat, and tears had, helped build this country. Where were they supposed to go? So that was the kernel that began this question. And so what I tell my students to answer your question is that there's a spectrum, right? Along which African Americans have engaged with Africa in a variety of ways. And then along that spectrum is the one where there's an imagination, there's a sort of an imagined idea of Africa that comes from, not knowing anything about Africa, right? But being, but just recognizing that this is where my ancestors came from, and you have the sort of imagined vision or idea of Africa. And then you have the real engagement, right? Which really begins in the 19th century, right? With the Liberia story, with the missionaries who go back and then takes us into the 20th century, when it's possible for African Americans to start being able to travel to Africa. That's when we begin to see the real engagement. So I think both are equally interesting and important, right? Because to think about the ways that, those who were brought here initially came with a real Africa, right? They came with a tangible knowledge of this place that we're calling Africa. It wasn't Africa to them. It was, my village in whatever a part of the continent I was taken from. It was very specific Africa, right? Over the centuries, it becomes less a tangible connection that African Americans have. And so that's when we begin to see these imagined ideas about Africa, because it's coming out of a space where you don't know anything about this past, right? This place. It's coming from maybe stories that have been passed down from you, stereotypical images of the continent that you're exposed to, right? So you begin to have these ideas about Africa that are not real. And then you have as people begin to be able to physically go to Africa, ideas there. And, and even some of that could be imagined, right? Because you have an idea when you go to Africa as an African American, and often, right, it's not what you expect when you get there. And we've seen lots of people from the diaspora write about those kinds of things about, I had this idea about when I would get to Africa, how it would be. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know what's going on with my screen. I just got a blank screen.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yes. Oh.
But we can see you and we
You
can
can
hear
see
you.
me? Okay.
Yeah,
We can see you.
perfectly. Yeah, we can
Yeah.
hear you clearly. We can see you clearly.
Okay. I don't know. I'm not sure what happened. Okay. Let's see if I can get back in. We hear this. So I had this idea when I got to Africa, and then when I got there, it wasn't as I imagined it, right? So I think both those are equally important and interesting to understand, and it's part of a way in which we have to understand the ways in which African Americans have thought about their connection to this place that we call Africa, right? Because Africa in itself, one could argue, is an imagined space.
Yeah.
There is no Africa,
Yes.
right? There's a landmass that we now call Africa. What meaning does it really have?
Indeed, Africa carries many meanings, even for Africans, even for people who now identify as Africans.
Yes, absolutely.
And that meaning is constantly being reimagined and evolving. So
exactly.
So absolutely. I was slipping one last question before I turn it over, because when it comes to this African American engagement with Africa and African Americans' imagination of Africa, it seems to me that it's not there is that, and maybe we'll come back to this later, but it seems to me that it's mediated by some externalities and powerful forces that neither Africans nor African Americans can control. So it's not exactly when African Americans go to Africa or when they stay in the United States and imagine Africa. They are using tropes and images and all kinds of textual productions that have been constructed already, that are already in existence about Africa.
About Africa.
So, yeah. So speak to this issue of mediation, whether it's media or whether it's knowledge that have been constructed
we talked about the ways in which Africa was historically represented, particularly in the 19th century, right? As this backward, savage place from which, in fact, you were saved by being enslaved, right? That you don't want to associate with, right? Because the association with Africa then becomes a negative thing if if the representations of this place is negative, is of a backward place, right? So there is that kind of representation, but there's the other extreme, right, of a kind of a romanticization, right, of Africa that's also in a way a stereotype, right? And then everything in between, right? So we have these, as you say, external, if you will, forces that are constructing Africa in a particular way that then you're forced to engage with, particularly when there's very little knowledge about Africa. And I think, as more knowledge about Africa has made its way to African Americans, you can see a more complex or nuanced, right, ways in which African Americans engage with Africa. But when you're presented with these stereotypes, whether positive or negative of a place, that's the Africa you will know. That's the Africa you've imagined, and that you're engaging with, right? Yeah.
Yeah, no, now that's fantastic. Thank you for those insightful responses. Farooq, your thoughts, please, on your
Yeah. Well, thank you so very much for joining us. I have been familiar with your great grandfather's work from high school.
Yeah.
My high school government and history classes.
Nice.
And I've always been amazed by the depth of his scholarship, the consuming passion of his commitment. So it feels unreal. It's actually surreal to have the privilege to be speaking with his granddaughter. Thank you so much for agreeing to, honor us with your presence in this month's edition of our program. Well, I have a question. The question I want to ask came out of the questions that many of my Facebook friends asked when I shared the link to this show. I tried to differentiate, just for the purposes of not confusing my predominantly Nigerian audience, African Americans, I call them Black Americans, and so instead of African American. But I of course, that's the subject of a lot of disputation within the Black community here.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a journalism professor, and I know that historically the Associated Press, which is like the Bible of journalism in the United States, used to ask that Black people not be identified as African Americans. It was always Black American. And the reason they gave for that was there were African Americans who did not like to be identified with the label African American, but almost no African American resents being called Black American. So they thought it was safer to go with Black
Mm-hmm.
American. But over time, they realized that I think based on studies, studies have shown that when people are asked to imagine a person and that person is described as Black American versus being described as African American,
Mm-hmm.
people have a more positive internal portrayal of the person who is called African American.
Mm.
Because it's like it's a person
Mm-hmm.
with a history, with a place. But when they say Black American, it's a more negative
Yes.
internal portrayal. Maybe I have no idea if that is what informed the relaxing of the rules by Associated Press to say now you can call everyone. But we know it's a continuing debate. And
Mm-hmm.
sometime in 2005, I outraged the sensibilities of my fellow Africans here when I said, those of us who are here, who are recent immigrants, have no right to be called African Americans. That
Mm-hmm.
term is a historically contingent terminology that
Mm-hmm.
emerged out of a conscious rejection of
Mm-hmm.
years of what I call appellative violence.
Yes.
Because African Americans have been called by names by other people, Negro,
Mm-hmm.
other N-words. And the first time they actually name themselves is when they call themselves African Americans.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I have not read the book, but I placed the order for it and I'll read it because these are issues. So I wanted to speak to the politics and the rhetoric of the naming.
Mm-hmm.
You probably are familiar with Ali Mazrui, who said, well, let's call ourselves American Africans. Those of us who are recent immigrants, you call American Africans, and reserve African Americans to people who are historically here, who have had a need to name themselves by, inventing that. So, so speak to one, the opposition to the term African American by certain African American people, and then two, the history behind the emergence of that term, and three, the insertion of recent African immigrants into this identity. Do we qualify to be called African Americans? Are we justified to be rejected from that label and to be pushed to identify or hyphenate our Americanness with our countries of origin, which are now known? Nigerian American, Sierra Leonean American, Liberian American, instead of African American.
So I should say, I mean, and this is how I start the book in my introduction, is discussing the naming. So my mother, who was born in Massachusetts, she's a Black American woman, African American woman, and I use them interchangeably. I should say that right off the bat. But for many people, it's political. There are people who will tell you, I'm not African American, I'm Black American. And so that's a very conscious choice that some people make. It's a preference, it's their choice. But my mother died at 92 when she died in 2020. And throughout those 92 years, she was colored, she was Negro, she was Afro-American. By the time she died, she was African American, right? And, I say to my students again, because again, this came out of teaching, that it's, people say, oh, they just say everything, like every generation they change their name. No, there's a historical context to it. Because when you go back to documents of the 18th century in this country, African was the appellation of choice for people. Because for one thing, Africa, there was a closeness to Africa in terms of time. There was a pride. You got the African Methodist Episcopal Church, African schools springing up, African Freemasonry, right? So the term African was embraced with pride by African Americans. As those negative images that we talked about before start to come into play in the 19th century, right? You have this idea of, oh, well, we need to distance ourselves from this place that's being constructed to us as negative. That's when you begin to see this label being dropped. so when we come back to it in 1989, when Jesse Jackson, is the sort of the one who pushes for, he says African American is the term we should use to assert our, our connection to this continent. We come back to the use of African. But for many, the embrace of that also is understood as making them less American, and they want to assert their Americanness because Black Americans in this country have always been made to feel that they do not belong. And part of the pushback on those who say, I'm an American, I don't need any hyphenation in front of it, is to say, we helped to build this country just as anybody else did, and we should be able to assert our Americanness. And so we don't want to muddy it by attaching the term African to it. We recognize our African ancestry, that's our history, but we're first and foremost Americans. So it's a very conscious choice that those who reject the label African American make. Those who say, I'm a Black American, it's an awareness and an embrace of their quote unquote, their race. And they see it as a more capacious term to embrace populations of African descent. So, a Caribbean American can say, I'm Black American. Even we as African immigrants can say, I'm a Black American, though they make the argument for that. So for many, it's a political term. It's using the term Black is a assertion of pride in their Blackness. So I think and I tell my students it's a choice on the part, so though some of us use them interchangeably, but for others, there's a clear distinction. And by saying, I will not use the term African American, I'm a Black American, because they want to privilege and assert their Americanness here. There are others who assert their pride as Americans and say, just because I call myself African American doesn't make me any less American. I can embrace my African heritage and be an American in the same way as the Irish American or the German American or the whatever hyphenated European American. As for recent immigrants and the use of African American, again, I think that's also one of these conscious choices people make. Sometimes immigrants choose not to use the term African American deliberately because they don't want to be associated with that historical experience that you talked about, and they do it deliberately. Of course, we know that in this country, it doesn't really matter what you call yourself, right? If you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, they're not asking you who you are, right? So it's a conscious choice on the part. So you say, oh, I'm Nigerian American, or I'm Sierra Leonean American. It's a highlighting of your nation and your heritage, right? So that's again a choice. But for others, the idea that, oh, I'm truly the African American because I've come directly from Africa, so I should have the right to call myself an African American. Is again another conscious choice on the part of African immigrants. So again, it's a preference, and people do label themselves for different reasons, and we all know that in every context we label ourselves or we identify in different ways for different reasons. And I think again, it's generational too. So you as a first generation African immigrant may say, oh, I'm Nigerian. You may not even say I'm Nigerian American. I'm Nigerian. You don't even add the American there, but your children, that your children may say they're Nigerian American, but for the most part, your children are African American. They've been sensitized to this society, right? They understand the context in which they need to embrace that identity, I think. So I think, and I always say to my students, we can call ourselves whatever we want, but ultimately in the end, sometimes it's how others perceive you, right? Or how others imagine you, or what labels other people thrust on you that are more important. Because again, if I'm a Black person walking down the place where I'm not deemed to belong in this country, nobody's asking me what I put in front of the American, if I put anything at all.
Okay, well, before I turn the mic metaphorically to Osmund Agbo. I have two questions, but I'll probably ask you to respond to one and come back to the other so that I don't dominate it. The first question is the relations between Africans on the continent and Africans in the historic diaspora, which is African Americans and Black Caribbeans. And you are uniquely positioned to answer this question because you embody all of the labyrinthine multiplicity of these identities: Caribbean, African, and African American. One of the things that I realized growing up in Nigeria is that a lot of us knew very little about the Black diaspora. For instance, when Haiti was in the news some time ago for, I don't recall what it was, a lot of Nigerians, were seeing and hearing of Haiti for the very first time. And so the discussions about, oh, that's the first independent Black nations. People are like, an independent Black nation in the Western Hemisphere? Where is that? And the ignorance was very embarrassing for a lot of us who live here, and our African American friends were reading. I actually became aware of this ignorance from my African American friends who said, I was on Twitter and I realized a lot of people from your country were hearing of Haiti for the very first time, and there was argument about the first independent Black nation. And I took literature classes. We did not even we didn't even do Black literature. I mean, I know Langston Hughes and all of that, but he was read more as an American poet, not an African American poet. And so there is a lot of ignorance of the historic Black diaspora in the Western Hemisphere by people in Africa.
Yes.
And I don't know what is responsible for this, what can bridge this gap. I had the privilege of meeting the younger brother to Alex Haley, who was an ambassador, the American ambassador to to the Gambia, Washington, D.C., and we were talking about this issue. And he said, I had the privilege of discussing with Olusegun Obasanjo about extending the privilege of dual citizenship to all Africans who are voluntarily dislocated in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah.
And but instead of doing that, he said, okay, I will make you an honorary citizen. So he was, I don't know whether he's still alive, but it pained him that there is no sufficiently robust relational intercourse between the diaspora here and there, except for Ghana and maybe Benin Republic recently. But even in the curriculum, we don't learn as much about our brothers and sisters in the diaspora as we should. So there's a disconnect. And that's why when Africans come here, they are encountering African Americans for the very first time, and they don't know the culture, the history, and this whole notion of model minority that Africans are made to feel, which is another, we are going to go into that, they buy into it. So from your experience growing up in West Africa, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, with an African-American mother and a father whose ancestry went back to the Caribbean, what is your sense of the relations between these various people, and what's responsible for this level of embarrassing ignorance of each other?
It's it's interesting because when I started this book, I was really not interested in relationships in as much as they would appear throughout, but my focus was not the relationship between African Americans and Africans. I was interested in how African Americans had engaged with the continent in these sort of real imagined ways that we've talked about. But when the book came out and I started doing book talks, I found that was the last part of the book where I actually touch on, African immigrants that people latched onto. Well, what about the relationship with what do Africans think of African Americans? I said, somebody else has to write that book, right? That's not what I what I set out to write about. But to get to the heart of your question, I grew up in Sierra Leone in the 1970s. I'm dating myself. What is it that we learned about African Americans? What did we see on televisions in West Africa about African Americans. The American cop shows where the Black people were the criminals. The worst representations and stereotypes of African Americans is what we saw on TV in, I don't know, Nigeria, but in Sierra Leone. So when I mean, I'm saying we, but I had an African American mother, so I knew more about that. I had an African American grandmother, so I knew a more realistic story, right? But for most of my classmates, what did they know? So they came to America when they came. That's the expectations. We were not taught. We were lucky in my high school if we read Chinua Achebe. Right, that was like the most outside of Sierra Leone. The rest was we learned, European literature, European history. I was lucky when I was in Form 5. We had the school I was in, our principal was very progressive. So she brought down a professor from the college to come teach us African history. But most schools did not have African history. They were not taught African history, much less African American history. So we come with that ignorance as immigrants. We come with those stereotypes of African Americans. That's what we know. That's what we've been shown. That's what we've been told. I hope it's changed. I hope in the intervening 30 or 40 years since I was a student in West Africa that the representations of African Americans is more diverse and is not the one that I was exposed to as a child. So there is that lack of knowledge about African Americans. So just as much as we can say African Americans have little knowledge about Africa, they don't know anything about it, it's the same. Where, the Africans are not taught about the experiences of African Americans. At least they weren't when I was growing up. I don't know what it's like now. So you're right. You're absolutely right. And so we create ideas about each other based on what we know. And if what we know are those stereotypes, those are the ideas that we have. But as I show in the book, there's been a long engagement between African Americans and Africans. And so in as much as I wanted to say, I had a larger point, it was to say, Africans and African Americans have had a long-standing relationship going back to the 19th century, maybe even earlier. This is not a new thing. It's not when African immigrants come to this country for the first time that this relationship started. My father married my mother in the 1950s. He was not the only one. So I wanted to dispel this myth of ignorance. Yes, there's quite a lot of ignorance, but there's historically also been quite a lot of interaction. But those are not the stories that make the news. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, that's true. You're absolutely right, Professor Blyden, because the conflictual, sort of tensile and adversarial aspect of the relation tends to be the one that is emphasized in a lot of popular discourse. And I always tell people that to reinforce the point that you and Farooq are making, that the relationship between African Americans and African immigrants and other African, continental Africans, it's not exactly a freestanding one, and because of all this mediation that goes on, and especially hegemonic mediation by people with all kinds of motives and interests, it colors the relationship, it interpolates it. I hate to use these big scholarly words, but it kind of makes the relationship even more tense, because now there is a basis, a negative basis from which both sides perceive one another. And it creates all kinds of expectations and all kinds of burdens. It's not a relationship that evolves for the most part organically, except for the ones now that are happening in terms of people-to-people relations, where people are.
And that's how it's always been. We're not the same. We're not the same. We're we're not the same in the countries that we come from. So this idea that we should all of a sudden have immediate understanding between ourselves. No, understanding comes with knowledge. Coming with me learning something about your culture and you learning something about mine, or my historical experience versus yours. We're not the same. But there are moments, particularly when we're living in societies like this, when we should quite clearly think of ourselves as, if not being the same, certainly having similar issues. And I think that's something that African immigrants learn fairly quickly when they get here.
Yeah, totally agree. And that's a solid basis, I always tell people, for solidarity.
Mhm.
If nothing else, the
Mhm.
fact that we have common issues and
Mhm.
common interests
Mhm.
in this place that we now call home
Yeah.
calls for greater solidarity.
Mhm.
Osmund, I'm sure you've been you've been listening, and you have a lot to say. You want to jump in, and I'm sure you have questions and thoughts.
You are muted, Osmond.
Osmond, you're still muted, so please take it away, Osmond.
Okay, can you guys hear me now?
Yes, we
Yes.
can. Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So thank you so much. I actually I think I'm more interested in just listening to you guys talk about all these things. There's just so much.
Osman, by the way, is a physician, so he comes to this from a completely different perspective, but also a refreshing perspective because
absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah,
he saves lives literally, and
Yes.
I would like to think like that. But anyway, let me join Farooq and Moses in thanking you especially for making yourself available for this encounter, especially coming on the heels of the Black History Month that was just concluded last month. It's very refreshing to hear some of these perspectives. Mine is, it's not going to be a question, at least for now. It's just going to be me giving my little take on this topic, and I believe what I'll set out to do is give my take, and you'll be able to maybe look at it and expand a little bit more. And in areas where I may have gotten it wrong, maybe you give us more perspective on that. And so there was a podcast recently that I was listening to, and one of the people there was an African American, and one of the topics that he raised is the fact that Africans are always feeling superior, but that the fact is when they talk about blacks, that the predominant culture in the whole world is actually African American culture. And I paused to think about it, and I think there is a lot of truth in what he said because I remember growing up in the 80s in Nigeria, and we all watched the Cosby Show. We all danced to hip hops. We like to dress like the African Americans, and a good number of us actually want to even mimic the accent. Even as at today, most Pentecostal churches in Nigeria basically mirrors what they do around here. So yes, the predominant culture seems to be that of the African Americans, and we had a lot of respect for them. I remember that very clearly. We want to be like them, and so you talked about the fact that the relationship is something that's gone on for generations. And that is true because I remember the early days of the Pan-Africanist movement. I believe it was in 1945 precisely that they had what they called the Fifth Pan-African Congress in Manchester, England,
Manchester.
where Nkrumah invited W.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, and all those things. And the whole point is trying to, get Africans from the colonial masters and also improve the life of African Americans here during the civil rights movement. So that was the whole point of it. Now, but what happened is it seems like when we got independence and then when Africans started to come here, things started to change. You know, the way we romanticize African Americans is not exactly the way we relate with them when we get here. And I think one of the things people talk about is the fact that friendship is always better when you come and visit each other and live. But when you start to live side by side and you start to find, a lot of things that are probably unsavory, and that might be part of it. Now, but we have all had different experiences, positive, not very positive, and sometimes outrightly, not good at all.
Right.
And so in this relationship, there are factors personally that I feel is responsible for the not so robust relationship between Africans, African Americans, and the rest of them. And I have it in three categories. One is the ills of stereotypes, misconception, ignorance, and all those things. And there was a very interesting study done by one anthropologist from Pennsylvania. Her name is Jacqueline Copeland Carson. And in this study, she talked about uh, basically, it called it Creating Africa in America, Translocal Identity in an Emerging World City. This study was published in University of Pennsylvania Press, and it was drawn from her experience in a Minnesota in public schools, where he studied both, the relationship between Africans and African American students.
Mm-hmm.
She said that for the African Americans, somehow they see the Africans as very less civilized, while the Africans tend to look at African Americans as people of low social status. Then he also went on to describe how, Africans tend to look at African Americans as very unpredictable people who are violent, and the African Americans tend to think of Africa as very ignorant and primitive. Then in terms of the image, the predominant image in the minds of African American students are like, they see African students as Tarzan's wild animals, those that reside in the dark continent, who should be avoided and should be reviled. While the Africans, they see them as very violent creatures, uncommonly rude, people who are lazy, disorganized, obsessed with racial images, have laissez-faire attitude towards family life and child raising. Those are the dominant narratives that, folks have in mind, and this is what has created some of these roadblocks. Then the second aspect of the problem is competition for limited opportunities. There is no gainsaying the fact that if you have to consider the world economy, Black people have the least market share. And what it means is that the limited opportunities that we have to grapple with now, we'll have to fight for it. And so when, for example, Lupita Nyong'o was casted in The Slave Girl in the 12 Years of Slave, many African Americans complained, why does it get to be an African? She didn't even have the experience. Why do we have to cast her and leave the rest of the African Americans? Now they also forget the fact that Don Chidem played the hotelier in Hotel Rwanda. He's American, he's not African, And then the other aspect, the other part
And
of it
Danny
also
Glover
like,
played Mandela, and so
huh?
on. Danny
I'm sorry?
Glover played Mandela, and so on and so forth.
Exactly. Then in the other one is this aspect of diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's always a complaint that in Harvard admissions, Nigeria takes up the slot of most, Black people. And this is not just even in America, even within Africa, especially in South Africa, we'll hear about xenophobia and all those. Because post-apartheid, a lot of Nigerians, but a lot of Africans moved to South Africa, and the South African indigenous feel like all these other Black people have come to snatch up some limited opportunities that would have been available to them. So the competition for the little resources at the disposal of Black people is also at the center of this dichotomy. And then the last is what I call external factors. Well, these external factors actually permeates even the first and second part of the problem. Whether it's during the time of slavery or colonialism, those that enslaved us and those that colonized us, one of the things that they did was to use the divide and rule tactics, where, they make Black people fight within themselves. And as they were doing that, they would be busy exploiting the resources, the natural resources, as the case may be. Of course, if we are all united and fight along the same line, it will be much difficult to exploit us. So I think this plays a very, very important role in not just in the relationship between Africans and African Americans, but even within the continent of Africa itself. We all hear about the raging war in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the East Congo. One of the biggest challenge they have there is the fact that when the Belgians, when the Belgians came in and put in some artificial boundaries, what they did was in the area of East Congo, where you have predominantly people who are of Rwandan descent, but because of the boundary, because of the artificial boundary of created by the Belgians, they ended up being in East Congo. And what happens? Each time there's an election or there's just any issue around there, the Congolese feel like these people, if have an issue, they're not even part of us. And that has been at the center of the conflict there, that gave rise to the M22 rebel groups and a host of other things. So what I'm saying in essence is the fact that the colonial masters and the slave owners, one of the things they did is to make sure that they put a range in between us to divide us more. And in doing so, they will be able to exploit us. They'll be able to make sure that we can unite and fight. So I think I'll stop so far, but these are some of the issues which I find very germane to our discussion here today. Thank you, Prof. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Professor Blyden, I mean, Osmund, you've raised a lot of questions, some of which I find quite provocative.
Professor
really.
Blyden, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yes. Professor Blyden, you're still muted, I suppose. Yeah. Oh.
Okay, maybe I need to mute her.
Okay, I think.
I'm trying to see.
Did you?
Yeah, okay.
But
Yeah,
you
sorry,
do that.
I muted myself because I didn't want to be distracting. So I won't do that again. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I hope you heard some of the things I
Oh, no, I
meant.
heard what you said. I just couldn't speak.
Yeah.
So, nothing that you say, is strange to me. I address all of some of those things in the book, the affirmative action conversation. And, as I said, I mean, it goes back to, the way I answered Moses's question about this idea of not knowing about each other can be a source of misunderstanding, right, and tension. And so that's that's part of the work that we should try to do, right, is to get to know to get to know each other and understand each other's historical experiences, because we are not the same, as you say. Even on the continent, we're not the same. So, and we shouldn't be expected to be the same. But there are certain moments where we have to be the same, if not be the same, or if you want to call it unified, work in unity, however you want to phrase that. So I think what I want to say is that I agree with most of what you said. I don't know that I have anything to add to what you said. These are real issues of tension, but I suppose I want to reiterate that that tension is not the sum total of the relationship. There are moments when there's competition, there's disagreement, and we should highlight that. We shouldn't say, we shouldn't minimize the fact that African Americans might have been upset by the fact that an African was cast in a role like that, because we know of the historical experience of how people come and jump over. The immigrant populations throughout the history of this country have come and jumped over African Americans, right? And so we can understand that sensitivity. On the part of Africans, Africans, like most immigrants, come to a place for upward mobility. When you come as an immigrant, no matter where you're from, you come to America, you come and you size up the hierarchy. And nobody wants to be at the bottom of that hierarchy. When you come to a place that has put people who look like you at the bottom of that hierarchy, what's your first impulse? It's to distance yourself. It's to not want to be associated with that group that's at the bottom of the hierarchy, because you're not here for that. You're just here to come put your head down and do your thing and supposedly go back, right? That's the immigrant ethos. You come, I'm just here to come and work, I'm going back. We're all going back when we come as immigrants. Yeah, isn't that the truth? And yet here we are. So this idea that, when you come as an immigrant, that's not where you want to be. You're looking to go upward. And if associating with African Americans is going to hold you back, so you think separating yourself is the thing to do until Amadou Diallo gets killed, until an African immigrant gets killed or arrested, or during the era of segregation is not allowed to sit in a whites only space restaurant. You quickly realize, in the eyes of the larger population, you're the same. My dad used to tell us that story when he was a student at Lincoln University, which is a historically Black college. I've told the story in other places. They would go, come Saturday, he said, the African students would all come out with their agbadas and their African outfits to go out on the town, thinking, right, that, the white Americans would, they're different. Yeah, they're not our Blacks, just like my Black American professor who went to South Africa in the 1980s was told, you're not like them, you're different. Yeah, you're not one of ours. But he would always end that. He said, the African students would go out in their time, would all look exotic. And yes, they would admire us. Where are you from? You look so exotic. But he would always end the story by saying, but you know what? When the African students wanted to rent rooms in the boarding houses of white Americans, they got the door slammed in their faces, just like they slammed it in the faces of the African Americans. So we're only as distinct, we're distinct only so far, in other words. So I think, these are the kinds, so the both sides have, one can understand both sides of those experiences, of those examples that you gave. Because when you come as an African immigrant, you just want to keep your head down. But now, African immigrants realize we can't just keep our heads down. You can't just say, I'm just coming to do my thing because I'm going back. You can't. We have children in this country who are getting stopped by police, who are getting harassed by police. So we can't keep our heads down.
And the more we remain in this country as immigrants, the greater the stakes we have in it, and therefore the greater the need for us to fight for it. And I'm reminded of when you were speaking, you were talking about limited resources and how African Americans and African immigrants fight for the limited resources that the white power structure makes available. And I think the problem has been that I think both sides have internalized some of the narratives about each other coming from the dominant white structure and have bought into this, what you described so well, Osmund, about, okay, we have to fight for this limited. When there's a different approach, it seems to me that could be more productive, which is to expand the pool of resources. Why don't we cooperate and unite and fight for what is available to be expanded instead of fighting over what is a limited pool of resources? And so but obviously there are people who want it that way. That's exactly what they want. That's the outcome that they want. So and they'll keep reinforcing the narrative. And Professor Blyden, I think you mentioned, when immigrants come here, it's interesting because, it's true that they want to get ahead and they will do whatever they can to get ahead, including ignoring the history of the Black struggle and distancing themselves from African Americans. But also, in their ear, there are people in their ear as well who are telling them the kinds of stuff that you heard. You are not like them. You are not one of them. Oh, you are different. You speak so well. You are very articulate and this and that, and you have the right values. So there's a way in which the immigrant comes here and becomes a blank slate and becomes available to be used and to be manipulated in the racial politics of America. And racial politics of America, as we know, is connected to resource allocation. It's not innocent, emotional racial politics for its own sake. It's about who gets what opportunity. And so that complicates the picture, because that desperation of the immigrants to make it, I think, makes the immigrant to be more receptive, I would say, to the kind of manipulative information and tactics of certain dominant structures and institutions in this country.
Because as Farooq says, we come not knowing anything.
Yeah.
Mostly, as you said, most immigrants come, they don't not knowing anything about African Americans. African immigrants come, they don't know. They just know about America, the land of milk and honey, or however that's what they come knowing. They don't know about the history. They don't know about the experiences of African Americans. They come with the
And that leads-
stereotypes that they got from representations, media, television.
Yes.
Okay, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Osmund, and then Farooq.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry. Just because you talked about the economics, I actually think that, economic disadvantage, most of the things that we suffer, most of the issues we have, even amongst ourselves as Africans, and even with African Americans and the other African diaspora, could be traced to economics. Because of our very poor economics, we always find ourselves at the bottom of the value chain, and when that happens, in my book, in my book, Black Grits and White Knuckles, I talked about internal racism, and it has to do with this thing we talked about. Because when you are at the bottom, when you find yourself at the bottom of the value chain, you tend to do things, most people tend to do things to try as much as possible to dissociate themselves. In other words, they try to say, oh, okay, I know we all are blacks, but I'm a little bit different. So if wearing a Jordan sneaker is going to make them look like they're then they'll stop wearing Jordan sneakers and the rest of them. Historically, the Jews also suffered a lot of things during the Holocaust and all those things, just like the blacks with the slavery and colonialism. But the difference between us and the Jews is that they have economic power. We don't. So they have economic power. So there is, they even with all the things they also went through, they don't go with the stigma of poverty and all the other ills that we have to deal with in the Black communities. So I just wanted to raise it that economics plays a very significant role in some of the issues that we have as a people.
Yeah, and maybe it's because Osman, maybe it's because maybe the Jewish people don't adopt this zero-sum game strategy of competition, whereby they perceive one Jewish person's gain as the other Jewish person's loss, and vice versa.
Because they have way more opportunities than us.
Well, of course, there are all kinds of contingent factors.
I'd like to believe that we are by numerical strength, we probably, if you count all the Africans, diaspora, and all those things, probably more than the Jewish population, in the world. Yeah. But what percentage of wealth in the world do we control as a people compared to the Jewish guy? That's the difference.
Well,
yeah.
Farooq is itching to do.
I want us to, we invited Professor Blyden here to benefit from her knowledge. So I want to go in and move. I want to move in the direction of questions to her. There's a story or an issue I wrote about previously in a Black History Month series, which is about the Gala Geechee culture. People in Nigeria were very fascinated by that. So I wanted to speak to that because, the Gala Geechee people are mostly from Sierra Leone, from the rice cultivating part of Sierra Leone. And before the start of this show, we were doing self-critiques of Nigerians boasting about jollof rice, when in fact, we're not a rice producing people, for the most part. Rice is a Sierra Leonean, Gambian, Senegalese thing. But, Turner, a linguist by the name of Turner, lived among the Gala Geechee people and found a song that they sing, a sort of funeral song that he recorded it. And so, I don't want to tell the story because I know you're going to entertain us more. But I'm bringing this example to talk that, in 2007, I was somewhere trying to look for swallow, and I saw someone that struck me as Nigerian. He looked like he was a Yoruba person. And I reached out to him and he said he was from Sierra Leone. So I said, oh, I thought you were Nigerian. He said, well, a lot of people mistake me for Nigerian, but because my roots are probably Nigerian. And he told me he was in the United States as a representative of a chief in Sierra Leone to connect with the Galagichi people here in Savannah, Georgia. And when I visited Savannah, Georgia, I saw the Galagichi people with my wife. My wife's mother is African American and who also lived in Nigeria for 30 plus years to teach. So again, I want to go back to the fact that our relationship is not always conflictual. There are a lot of intermarriages that people don't talk about. And some of these historical connections that existed between our people are being nourished. So I wanted to talk to us about Galagichi people and how they are able to retain, for the most part, even their way of speaking. Because when I found them in Savannah, Georgia, I was telling my wife, we didn't hear exactly what they were saying, but I said, these people sound West African.
Yes.
What West African language they were speaking, I had no idea. And then as we got closer, I said, oh, these guys are speaking Pidgin English.
Like Creole.
Either Cameroonian, Nigerian, one of them. And then as we got even closer, then I realized, I said, okay, this is probably Creole. So when we got to there and I said, hi. And then they switched back to American English. And I said, what were you people speaking before? I'm asking because, and they could tell from my accent that I wasn't American. I said, I'm from West Africa. And what we heard you speaking, it struck us as a West African language, but now you've switched and you are all American. So we're wondering. And they said, well, that was Galagichi. I said, wow.
Yes. Yeah.
So I wrote about my experiences in my column, which fascinated a lot of our people.
Yeah.
And I wanted to speak to that because you're from Sierra Leone, you are a historian, and all of that. So the connections historically and in contemporary times between Africans and Africans in the diaspora.
So when Osmund was talking about the influence of African American culture around the world and how dominant it is, the thought that popped into my head is that it's African American, but it's influenced by Africa.
That's right.
Right. So a lot of what I do in the book is talk about the things that Africans brought here that influenced American culture and African American culture specifically. And of course, the Gullah are the classic example of that. This is a population that you know, a lot of times scholars who look at what we call African cultural retentions, how much of Africa was retained in diaspora cultures, we look to the Caribbean, places like Haiti, where the numbers of Africans far outweighed the numbers of Europeans. But for the United States, we often, you know, for a long time, scholars made the argument that, you know, slavery was so horrible in the United States, Africans didn't retain any part of what they brought with them from Africa. That's not true. We know people come with elements that they can never lose. And so the Gullah feature the representative group that we use to show that in the United States because of sort of the isolated areas where they were, because, you know, places like South Carolina had larger populations of Africans, plantations in South Carolina, because again, that region was inhospitable climate-wise for whites. Often you might have an overseer on a plantation in South Carolina who was Black. So many more elements, if you will, of African cultural practices were retained. And in the Gullah, the language practices as well. And it was Lorenzo Turner, who you talked about, who was an African-American linguist, who in the 1930s heard a song being sung by a Gullah woman. And it was clear it was an African from somewhere in Africa. So what he did was he interviewed quite a number of African students who were here at that time. So again, these connections, there were students so he found them and got them to listen to the song. Eventually, they realized it was a Mende song from the Mende people in Sierra Leone. But like many African languages, there are dialects in Mende. So they knew that it was an African song, but what its meaning was not clear. It was not until the 1980s when an anthropologist, I think he was, and a musicologist, took the song and traveled around Sierra Leone with it. And a woman in a village in Sierra Leone recognized the song, and it turned out it was a funeral song. And so the woman, the African-American woman's granddaughter, one of her descendants went to Africa. A group of Gullah people went to Sierra Leone. And so this strong connection between Sierra Leone and the Gullahs has been established. But what was also established was, for the longest time, we sort of talked about the enslavement of Africans as being random. They were just taken from one place and taken to another. We realized that it was much more structured than that people with specific know-how were brought from Africa to places. And there's documentation that planters in South Carolina, that was a rice-growing area, specifically brought Africans from those rice-growing areas because of their know-how, their knowledge of rice growing, to be enslaved on those plantations. So scholars were able to find out that direct link between Sierra Leone, that Guinea, that rice growing area, and the Gullah Geechee population. And then, of course, elements of the language. It's a Creole language in a way, as Pidgin is, or as Creole in Sierra Leone was, so that if you speak Creole from Sierra Leone, you can understand some of the Gullah language. So these Africanisms that we talk about that have been retained. Most people know the word tote, to carry something. Tote, that's a word from Africa. That's from an African language. There are all these words that we take for granted. Okay, that's a word with an African derivative. So all of these influences that appear in African American and American culture and language, which are part of, that were brought by people from the continent. So that link has really now been solidified between the Gullah Geechee people and Sierra Leone, that has resulted in all sorts of initiatives, visits back and forth. A group of Gullah went to Sierra Leone in '89, but also in 2019. So that sort of relationship, Gullah people who have been made honorary citizens of Sierra Leone. So those kinds of relations. And, there are other parts of the diaspora that have also been able to draw those connections between where on the continent people might have been enslaved and brought to specific places in the Americas. So that's another sort of very important story that shows, right, this kind of circular nature of the relationship between Africa and African Americans, because those influences that those enslaved Africans brought have made their way into African American culture. So you can draw a straight line that if those of us who watched High on the Hog on Netflix, the food practices of African Americans, where Africa features in there, in the music, in the dance, right? So when you say, Africans are being influenced by hip hop and African Americans culture, it's our culture going back to us in a way. You could make that argument. We don't know how strongly you want to make that argument because, can never draw those direct lines. Cultures change, they evolve, they adapt, right, to the places where they're brought. But elements of Africa have always remained in African American cultural practices and language and religion and things like that.
Well, thank you so much for that wide-ranging response. I'm going to read a comment here that I found quite useful. It's related to what Osmund was talking about in terms of the disparity between the Jewish people as one set of victims and Africans or African diasporic as another set of victims, but with very contrasting economic fortunes in the present. Joa, one of our listeners, says they come from poverty, that is the Jewish people, but skin color has given them an upper hand, which has given them more opportunities, and they are more collaborative because the world has come to rally around their plight, whereas blacks are told to just get over their plight. So I think this is a very insightful comment. But I want to ask two questions before we turn it over to the audience, before we start getting questions and contributions from the audience. Here, there is the concept of model minority that Farooq mentioned earlier. But I want us to, for those of us who are, for our audience, it is this notion that African immigrants are an overachieving set of immigrants, and that they tend to have, more advanced degrees and earn more money and get into the professions at a much higher rate than the native-born Americans, Black Americans, and therefore that they are an example, a model for those people, and so on and so forth. It is a myth. that works on two levels. It assumes that Africans are overachievers, and it assumes that African Americans, native-born Black Americans, are underachievers, right? So I've written about it in some other contexts, but I would like you to speak to it because there seems to be a lot of ignorance. Speaking of ignorance amongst our people, African immigrants, but also Africans living on the continent on this issue. They seem to have bought into it massively. Much to my disappointment, it causes me so much despair and depression when I see my Facebook friends gleefully sharing video clips and all kinds of things related to this, affirming this myth of the model minority. The other time, a few months ago, the right-wing Black commentator, Owens, Candace Owens made the rounds in Nigerian social media because she had said something about Nigerian immigrants being the most educated, the most advanced, and this and that, most accomplished set of immigrants. So I'd like to, that's one question. The other question that I wanted to talk about is the ADOS, American Descendants of Slavery. That's an organization that has a different agenda, that has an agenda that is quite frankly opposed to the idea of connecting African Americans to Africans and coming together in solidarity. They have an agenda that stokes some of the tensions that Osmund was talking about in terms of African immigrants. They claim that African immigrants are coming here and taking opportunities, educational scholarships and opportunities away from them and jobs and so on and so forth. So the model minority and ADOS, what are your thoughts, Professor Blyden?
Well, what's missing from the model minority analysis, of course, is a class dimension, right? It's based on immigrants who, came earlier when, the legislation was opened up in 1965, Hatzela. The Africans who were coming here were largely from a particular class, elite, people whose parents could afford to send them to college here. It doesn't account for the large, significant African immigrant population that has come since the 1980s, that is much diverse in terms of its educational background, economic background, the refugee populations, right? So it's, again, one of these myths that are made, again, I think, to divide, because we know that we're not all monolithic, and all Africans are not educated. Most Africans who come, especially particularly in recent years, are not college educated in the way that those who perhaps came earlier in the 1970s and 1980s were educated. So I think that model minority myth, as you say, is, has a particular purpose in mind, and those who buy into it, sadly, are buying into something that's not necessarily true. Now, it's true that there are a lot of, so when you aggregate, I suppose, I don't know how they do the math, when you aggregate, perhaps it is, and those kinds of inflammatory headlines, African immigrants are the most educated of all, when you dig into it, there's more to the story than just that, right? But if you buy into the headlines, that's what you see, and it doesn't account for all those African immigrants who are coming and living in urban areas side by side with African Americans who don't go to college, who don't have an education, who are working menial jobs. That statistic is not taking into account those people. But again, I'm not a statistician, I'm not an economist. ADOS, I first heard about, actually, it's funny, when I did the first interview, somebody interviewed me for a radio show when I wrote my book, and somebody said, what about ADOS? And I had never heard of them before. And so I went and did my research. And ADOS stands for African Descendants of Slavery, that makes a point about the fact that those who were, the descendants of enslaved Africans are deserving of reparations. They claim to have put reparations on the table as a topic of conversation. That's absolutely not true, of course, but they've, sort of have made that claim. And on the face of it, what they're saying about, what they're owed is not wrong. Immigrants who have not had that experience shouldn't come here and expect to get reparation. I don't know who's going to be writing a check to anybody But anyway, that's a different conversation altogether. But this, so on the face of what they're saying, it's not wrong. What I'm bothered by is the sort of anti-immigrant, as you say, narrative that surrounds it. That sort of there's a sort of a narrative around it that's calling for a divisiveness and a kind of, they're coming to take our jobs, which is, I'm not sure that that's even necessarily true, but we could make even an argument even about that. The affirmative action thing that immigrants, we all know that that's true to a certain extent, that Black immigrants do benefit from affirmative action. These are the things that some of us have, that some African immigrants have benefited. So all that aside, but to me, it's that sort of anti-immigrant narrative. And I'm not on Twitter anymore, but I was found by the ADOS people on Twitter, and I did a talk about African immigrants on the Library of Congress, and apparently my name was bandied about in the ADOS circles. And I chuckled because I said to myself, and somebody jumped in and said, well, you don't really know who she is then if you're saying these things, because what do they do with somebody like me? Who has an African-American mother, who has an uncle who was in the American Navy, who has a grandfather who died as a result of inhalation of gases in World War I. What do they do with me? Somebody like me, I would be be a wrench in the thing for ADOS, because I'm also ostensibly, arguably, an African immigrant, even though I was born here, right? So I think that, they attack people who are, African American. They attacked Ta-Nehisi Coates, I understand, when he wrote that article about reparations. So they go after, but so I don't know what their agenda is the truth of it. So I'm not knowledgeable enough for them, but that's the thing that bothers me about that group, is the sort of anti-immigrant narrative that's underlying a lot of their conversation. Because at the heart of what they're saying is that, yes, we as descendants of enslaved Africans deserve, and I absolutely would agree with that. We're not getting a check, but we do deserve, if you make an argument for reparations, and that I don't have to make that case. That beautiful article that Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote that everybody should read on reparations is a template for how, but if they think that we're cutting the pie smaller because somebody is going to give us a check, we'll be waiting for a long time for that. So that's the thing but on the face of what they're saying about what we as descendants of Africans who were enslaved do in this country, absolutely.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Complicated.
It's a very presumptive and preemptive sort of ideology that they are working with. They presuming that there will be a check someday down the line, and and that therefore we need to protect our share of that check, hypothetically, from other Black populations that might want to share.
And there are African Americans who've made greater cases for how reparation can work in this country, and that's literature that I'm not as familiar with, and but that's important.
Absolutely, and this idea, construction of African immigrants, Caribbean immigrants as the enemy, rather than focusing your attention and your activism on the white power structure that holds the key to power and to economics and to resources and so on. Fascinating. There's a comment here that I'll just read before we go to the audience that related to Osmund. You seem to have broached a very important subject that people are liking. So Professor Daniela Fairweather, who's with us, she says, in addition to Ajoa's comment that I read earlier, she says, absolutely, in relation to the Jewish, the difference between the Jewish conditions and African Americans or Black people, say, absolutely, skin color plus material reparations have given them the upper hand. So Black victims were not given material reparations. So it's not just the fact that they do get the benefit of the doubt as a result of their skin color. And in the American context, obviously, Jewish people have been absorbed into whiteness, political and economic whiteness. But it's also the fact that they got reparations. So that gave them a head start, is what Professor Daniela Fairweather is saying here. With that comment read, I think we'd like to go to the audience now.
Yeah,
Farooq, how is it looking? Yes.
there's some comments from Facebook that
Okay.
I don't know how many of them we can take,
Okay.
but there's one here that says, which is something that I had talked about in the previous article, that Af that Africans, and that sort of goes back to what Osmund said earlier. He said, as Africans, we've always loved and admired African Americans. And this person is in Nigeria. And so he said, on social media, however, I see African Americans say that we Africans don't like them, that we look down on them and all that. So he said, please tell them that this narrative is false. So basically that if there are any Africans who look down on them, who don't like them, it's probably Africans who live in the United States, not Africans who live on the continent. So I don't know if you want to speak to that.
And I think it's part of, although we've talked about this idea of this, representation, the ways in which, each group, and we're not going to think alike. We're not going to be the same. We will have tensions. We will have misunderstandings, but that's not the sum total of the relationship.
Any other comments, Farooq? There's somebody who would like to contribute, but let's take some comments first, and then
Okay.
there's Tehimba Osuji, who has been itching to contribute, but we can. Do you see him? He said, I would like to share some insight.
Yeah. Well, so if you want to speak, please raise your hand so that I can unmute you.
Yes. Okay. Here we go. There's a hand raised.
Adwa.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
There's a hand
Ask
raised.
to unmute.
So, can she unmute herself?
Yes, I have already. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I have to unmute them before they can unmute.
Okay, great. So, Ajua, you have the floor.
Oh, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm so happy I ran across this this Zoom meeting. I am African American, living in Ghana, and I am a mental health therapist. And most of my clients, my practice is based in Maryland and DC. Most of my clients, I focus on first generation African and Caribbean individuals. And so this discussion is really something that I kind of have all the time with my clients, and helping them. A lot of times their biggest issue is navigating white spaces, because their parents came to America and they kind of kept their head down, and they didn't really learn and understand racism and what it looks like, and they were not able to teach their children how to navigate racism. So now those children are adults in educational institutions and in the workplace, and struggling to navigate how to work around and endure the microaggressions and racism that they experience. And I wanted to speak on the last comment about African Americans feeling that Africans don't like them. I think this really is rooted in the westernized Eurocentric narrative that has been, kind of put in place to divide us. And I remember, and when I was in college, and there was an African student, he had been recruited to play football in America, and he and I were the only people of color in this class, and it was a some type of sociology class. I can't remember the exact name of it. Sorry. And we were discussing the Black American experience and how many Black people live in poverty. And he said, yeah, they're all just lazy. And he just went on to this negative narrative. And I'm like, wait a minute. And I had to unfortunately have this discussion in front of a class full of white people, but it was something I needed to correct, because I knew he had been brought over by whites, and it's like when Africans come to America, they're told, like, you are different, you stay away from those Black people and so forth. And as you all spoke earlier, Africans are not told about our history. They don't know what happened to the ancestors once they were taken away and sent to America. They have no idea. And living on the continent, I have made a point to try to be that bridge, because I am half Ghanaian as well, to try to educate, Ghanaians about like what has happened, and it's hard coming into this environment because we're seen as outsiders, period. Even though I'm half Ghanaian, I'm like, hey, I'm family, but I have to fight, to be accepted in that sense. And so there's this divide that's even on the continent. And so we definitely have to work to educate each other, but it's like there's this attitude of like, okay, well, you're here in Ghana, or even other people that I know that are in other countries. It's like they're like, well, you're here, so you need to learn everything about us, but there's not, that reciprocation of like, okay, but you guys need to learn about us as well because we have a lot to offer and to contribute to, the development of the country. But so we've got to really work to bring down that wall that has been placed, between us by the white Western world. Sorry to make that so long-winded, but
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Ajua, for your contribution.
And there's another contribution that's sort of related to what Adua just said. And this is from, my sister-in-law, whose mother is African American and father is Nigerian. So he said, there will always be more divisions, and we all don't appreciate the difference, but most especially, her name is Olivia Erene. The topic hits home for me because my father is Nigerian and my mother is African American. I was born in America, but shipped back to Nigeria as a baby. As I grew up, I moved back and forth as a child, and I could write a book on my experiences, but as a child, I had a worse experience on how I was accepted here in the United States, and have a lot more to share, but I might be able to complete her thoughts. So she's basically, and the last speaker, Professor Blyden herself, sort of inhabits this space where they are both here and there.
Yeah.
And, depending on where you are, her mother actually changed her accent. That's my mother-in-law, because she taught math in Nigeria, and she said math was hard enough, and to have to contend with a foreign accent was too much.
Yes.
So she struggled really hard to speak like a Nigerian. So that each time she came back home, when she retired and came back home, she was called the African woman. And she never, I said, why didn't you correct them? She said, because I'm really an African, and there's no need to correct anyone. So in spite of all of these difficulties and tensions in the relationship, there are bright spots. And I see that bright spot from my own experiences. And my wife is even in the room here, so maybe she's going to speak to her own experiences. But Professor Sadiq Abdullahi,
Professor Sadiq Abdullahi has his hand up. Yes, we can take that. And there's a comment here. We can come back to the comment later. By Kweku Minta Dankwa. But let's take Professor Sadiq Abdullahi first, right? What do you think, Farooq? I think he's unmuted, right?
He's unmuted.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, Prof,
Yes,
go ahead, please.
Okay. I'm calling from Miami, Florida. And I'm glad to be here. Thanks, Farooq, for the connection. I've listened and I've taken a lot of notes. We've covered historical, to some extent political. We talked about economics a lot. Osman's presentation. And then within the contents of sociology, we also talk about this psychology of African Americans in the Western Hemisphere, in Africa, as well as in America, within the context of the presentation. So, Professor Blyden, thank you very much. I am a curriculum studies professor, as well as a global education professor. So I'm interested in how all of this fits into the new narrative. When we look at the African Renaissance movement, if we look at the human rights movement, because you mentioned the 19th century up to the contemporary period, right? And then and all of that, we've covered everything. Now, my observation is that there has been a loss in momentum that started, in my experience, in the late 1990s. And I'm from Florida, so I know, the struggle that we've been having at Florida International University in the 1990s, where the affirmative action, Professor Blyden, you talk about that, that opens up so many doors, including myself, right, to balance. And after that period, and we arrive at, we got to early 2000, the 24th century, we begin to see shift, right? Florida now has taken the lead where, let me go back. Professor Banks and the rest with the multicultural movement, that took shape in the 80s and the 90s became almost extinct now in the schools. Now, I can go on and on and on, but let me wrap it up by asking this question. Number one, how can we revive, this movement, knowing that there's a deliberate act in America, to undermine African American history, for example, in secondary schools, right? So that's one. The multicultural movement has died, and I know that I have the answer, but I don't have time and space to go over them now. Now, to go back to Nigeria, I'm glad, or Africa, right? I'm glad that recently the Nigerian government is going to return history to the schools. And I'm hoping that Farooq and I will, continue talking about how we can shape, the writing of what goes into, the history, right? That conversation needs to start again, because the curriculum designers within the Federal Ministry of Education are already working on it. But again, we don't know what is going in there. And I think this is going to be significant in order to change the narrative and then get it. What is going to be in the history books, that is being revived? So there's so many questions, but I'm going to stop here. And I hope that Professor Agbo, Pagare, and Biden and Oshomo can shed light as we talk about contemporary shift in our thinking, in order to help, right? Now, finally, though, there's a political challenge in Africa. There's an economic challenge in Africa, social challenge in Africa. Nigeria is become a laboratory, for what is good and what is bad. And I think in education, the education must be redefined. So that is my interest, and that is why, I am part of this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Yes.
I mean, I don't know that I have an answer, I think, except to keep doing what we're doing, trying to do what we're doing to educate our young ones, our children. I was, involved with the Advanced Placement African American History course, which came under such attack in the last couple of years, but it's being taught in schools. Our children are learning that, I know there was a lot of sort of division about, some people supporting it, some people not supporting it. My point of view was always that, that we assume that all children, we hope that all our children will go to college, but not all of them will go to college. And those who don't get to go to college and take a class like the Introduction to African American History class that I'm teaching right now at my university that has 160 students in it, might have the opportunity to take that class in high school. Right. So we do what we keep doing and keep teaching our history to our children. And that's true here. You heard me talk about how little we got when we were going to school in Africa. I'm not sure it's any better now. I don't know what the schools in Sierra Leone are teaching now about either African history or African American history. So it is a global, in some way, Black problem of needing to have our history taught to our young people. But, for some people, history is not important anymore. So that's another conversation altogether, which I don't think we have time for here. That's my take on it.
Yes,
There's a
thank you
question.
so
Maybe
much.
Moses will read that. I think it's from Professor.
Is it in the comments?
Yeah, from Professor Kwaku.
Okay, yes.
I don't know what.
Let me go back to it.
A lot of Kwakos today.
Yes,
Kwaku.
go back to
Minta
it. The one
Dankwa.
that says yes.
So what's the way forward for
Your
collaboration?
question is, what is the way forward for collaborations? Historically, ideas about colonization have failed to bridge the gap between Africans and African Americans. Recently, Ghana has given some land to African descendants in the diaspora, and it has raised some debates. How do we collaborate going forward is the question.
I mean, I think as we've always had, right? As we've always done, by having conversations with each other, by learning about each other, right? By understanding, by understanding each other's experiences and recognizing that we have differences, but we also have similarities in our historical experiences. We've all talked about, the challenges for African descended people, no matter where in the world we are. Right, and understanding that is I think crucial. That's what I would say as far as the land issue in Ghana. I don't know that much about it. It's true that African governments pay a lot of lip service, right, in terms of how they reach out to the African diaspora. My sense is when they're thinking about reaching out to the African diaspora, is they're reaching out to their African immigrant populations rather than the historic African diaspora. So some are doing better than others in welcoming the historic African diaspora, but for the most part, it's a larger reach. It's reaching out to populations from individual countries that have spread to other parts of the world, that immigrant population, for whatever reason.
Yeah, Professor Blyden, and I would also add that when these African governments are doing the outreach, as it were, they are also doing it under this narrow, problematic rubric of foreign direct investment, FDI, which is
I did not want to use that word, but yes, absolutely.
So, and that's a wrong premise.
Yeah. Because I remember, for example, during the COVID pandemic, one of my great disappointments was the silence of a lot of African leaders about the experiences of African Americans who were the hardest hit by the pandemic. And there was the AU, I think, eventually put out a very tepid statement, but there was very much silence on, that was a moment. We talk about the ways in which, African Americans over the centuries always reached out, whether, as problematic as some of that narrative was of, we want to uplift our brothers and sisters in Africa, blah, blah. But, I mean, I think that was a moment for African governments to really, say we stand. We can make strong statements, and I didn't hear that, but maybe I missed it.
Well, that's a quick correction. This is important. I think the Kweku Minta Dankwa talked about that the Ghanaian government giving land to folks in the diaspora, and he's just been corrected by our sister Ajua, who says the government did not give anyone land. This is not true. The new development is by a private group that bought the land themselves. The government has done a poor job of reintegrating the diaspora. So another perspective there, which is an important one.
Terhamba Osuji wants to speak, but he says he cannot raise his hand. So if you are still here, Terhamba, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing them correctly. Are you here? Do you want to speak? I can unmute you.
Yeah, you can unmute and Osuji. Yeah, he's here. He's in the comments.
Yes. Hello, panel. How is everybody?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a very interesting discussion, and I'm just going to get straight to the point. I think when we're talking about Americans of African descent, we need to understand that the only similarity between us, in most cases, is our color, for lack of a better term, and a shared ancestry. We kind of underestimate how sociological we are different and how educationally trained we are. I mean, we're just on parallel universes. I mean, they're just different. They're trained different. They read different books. They have a different curriculum. They have a different cultural identity. They have a different way of thought patterns, a different food. I mean, the commonalities between us, they are very limited. So you're dealing with two different people. So I think one of the problems with Africans or even with Americans of African descent is that, we don't understand that although we share the same heritage, the same bloodline, or we're all descended from one ancestor, however you want to put it, we are virtually different people. And you have to take note of that. So that's enough about that. I mean,
I think that's been recognized throughout the conversation today. I don't think anybody here is saying that we're the
well,
same.
I don't think people really understand or focus on that. They just assume, hey, we're just Black people.
I don't think that's true. I don't necessarily think that's true. I would disagree with
that's
that.
my experience anyway. It just seems like I mean, you could talk about the history. Who are your historical heroes? Who are your leaders? If I'm Igbo, I would talk about Nnamdi Azikiwe. That's our leaders. If you're Black, an American of African descent, you'll be talking about Marcus Garvey. You'll be talking about Martin Luther King. You'll be talking about some of the Buffalo Soldiers. Those are your reference points. So it's different. The poetry is different. The history is different. And then when you talk about that too, another thing is that the bloodlines, Africans who come from Africa to America, they can trace back their origins back to a village. When you're talking about Americans of African descent, you're talking about people, I mean, they've been intermarried, the bloodlines have been mixed deliberately through slavery or just by the nature of events. So you're talking to a Black person, maybe his great-grandfather was from Jamaica, his mom is from South Carolina. It's a mixture. So, so that's...
But I think that's what we've been talking about for the last hour and a half. I don't think anybody would dispute what you're saying. I don't think anybody so I'm not sure. Yeah.
I just want to bring that to the fore. And then the second one is that I think when we try to join with the African American community, I think Africans come from a superiority. Well, I wouldn't call
complex.
it superiority, but I would call it...
You can call it that.
Okay, yeah. They come from a superiority complex that they know better. And some of the themes that I've heard to confirm that, these Black Americans, they don't know anything or they're rowdy and everything. So we come from a false superiority complex when we come here. We really don't have anything to offer from Africa. I mean, we don't know our language. We don't read and write. We don't read it. We don't write it. We're not very fluent in the language.
Yeah.
We don't have many of our cultures codified. They are passed on.
Thank you, Suji.
I think we've recognized that they are mutually
and then
reinforcing stereotypes.
The last point I'd like to make, and then I think back in the 60s, there was a focused movement of, Nkrumah, Azikiwe, I'm not using the right terms, of raising the African consciousness. And then there are a couple of Black leaders that migrated to Africa. There was that movement, that push. Right now, that seems to be non-existent, or maybe it's very low key. So I think most of Africa, they need to focus more, teach history in school, and make a case for reparations, for better treatment of Americans of African descent. And then the last piece of the puzzle is, when we come here, we need to join whatever Black American struggle. We're not educated enough to even join the struggle that the Black Americans or Americans of African descent have We don't understand mass movements. So when we come here, there's so many movements. There's one about stopping Black people from getting incarcerated, equal rights, equal housing rights. There's so many movements that we're not educated enough to join. So even when we want to collaborate, I think from the African immigrant coming in here, they have no clue on what to join the existing movements. And so I think when we come here, we need to reach out to the Americans of African descent communities.
Thank you.
And
I'm
I
sorry.
think that's what we've been
That's a
saying.
great point. Great point at
I'm
the
sorry
end.
to cut. Yeah, that's a great point. And of course, we talked about immigrant anxieties, which are not limited to Black people. So when you are a first generation immigrant, you are filled with anxieties about survival, about adjusting. So typically, the second generation, becomes indistinguishable from the native population and they join. But I don't know if Mankutan, who is Tracy Keith Fleming, wants to say something because he pushed back on your earlier claim that color is the only common denominator between Black people on the continent and Black people here. But if he doesn't want to, I just wanted to bring that to the attention. He says scholarship has refuted that claim.
Well, I mean, that's easy to say, but when you look at it, I mean, the music is different. It's very underrated. Like you meet somebody, you just meet an American of African descent. You meet them. What do you talk about? I mean, you talk about culture. You're on a parallel universe. If you talk about marriage, you're on a completely different universe. You talk about history. Our historical focuses are different. Okay, what do you
Not
think?
exactly. Not exactly.
Well,
I don't know the kind of African Americans you are mixing and associating with.
No,
With
well,
all due
exactly.
respect.
If you meet an African in Nigeria and Angolan, Ghanaian, they come to their own thoughts about what's wrong with America. It's completely different, and then they have that escape route. If things go bad in America, they can always go back to Nigeria, and their focus is always to get their education and go back to Nigeria. So you're dealing with, I think this is, even when you're talking about literature, you talk about maybe things fall apart.
I've lived in America for almost 3 decades, and I've never had any trouble breaking the ice, conversational ice with African Americans. Finding things to talk
that's
about.
on a personal communication. I mean, you don't have, that's not a problem when you meet people. I mean,
it's always so easy to find stuff to talk about. That stuff that's common to
but when
our
you
experiences.
when you try to assimilate the mission.
Well, we have to round up very soon, unfortunately.
We are running out of time.
We are running out of time now. We're sorry to cut you off, please.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt. I mean, but I just wanted to contribute. I feel very strongly about it, and maybe next time we'll have a.
Thank you. Maybe we can. But we have only 8 minutes, and we have to. So anyway, Farooq, do we have any more comments?
Yes, I don't know if Tracy wants to speak to this because I think I know him by reputation. If he wants to say something about
Tracy, whom I'm known for a long time since our days in grad school in Michigan. Tracy.
Okay.
Hi, Tracy.
Who lives in Ghana now, I believe. Tracy, are you there? Are you with us? Okay, maybe not, but that's fine.
I think. Let me see. Maybe I need to unmute him.
Oh, you need to unmute him. Okay.
Yeah, I've changed.
Oh, he can unmute. Yeah, there we go.
Unable to unmute. Oh, he's unable to unmute, he says.
There you go. Okay.
Yeah, I've unmuted. Now you can't speak without being unmuted. I have to do the unmuting.
Oh, okay. So now
just to avoid what happened, previous times.
Yeah, I didn't have much more to say besides that there is plenty of scholarship to help us understand some of the common characteristics among African populations on a global scale. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. I think that the conversation we've had for the past almost 2 hours backs that suggestion up. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Tracy.
I thoroughly enjoyed the dialogue. Thank you all.
Thanks. Hi, Tracy. How are you?
I'm
Well,
fine,
Professor
thank
Blyden, I have one last maybe question.
Uh-huh.
And that came out from last. What are your thoughts about what I call recreational genetics,
Ooh.
where African Americans are increasingly interested in, uncovering their African roots.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
myself took a DNA test, the ancestry DNA with my
Mm-hmm.
mom, because
Mm-hmm.
I discovered that from her last name, she might have something to do with Mali, and she
Mm-hmm.
said no. So when we did it, I was right.
Yeah.
So my
Mm-hmm.
my DNA is in the database, and I get a lot of requests from African
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
who ask that,
Yeah.
hey, we are cousins.
Mm-hmm.
So what my tribe be? And I said, I
Mm-hmm.
also from all over West Africa.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't really know how we are related.
Right.
So
Yeah.
what's your take
Yeah.
on recreational genetics among
Yeah.
African Americans wanting to discover their roots?
So I talk a little bit about that in the book. And, I'm not a scientist, so I don't know the sciences. There are people, of course, who are skeptical of some of those DNA tests. And for me, its importance for the long sweep of African American engagement with Africa, they've only been able to engage with or identify with Africa, this place that we're calling Africa. If DNA tests do nothing, even how as erroneous as some of them might be, as spurious as some of us might be suspicious of how accurate they are, they give African Americans a specific place in Africa that they can engage with. So the example I use in my book is the example of and I quote him, the Black American actor Isaiah Washington, who did his DNA test, got tied to Sierra Leone, and ran with it. Building schools there, he's claimed it as his country, right? So in as much as, we don't really know that that's where his people were taken from, whatever, that it now gives people in the diaspora an opportunity to be specific about their engagement with Africa and no longer have to feel like they just have to identify with Africa, the whole continent. And so in that sense, I think it's a wonderful thing because then it allows those who do want to engage, right? There are those who do it but are not interested. So Morgan Freeman is the example I use. Was happy to take his DNA test. Was told, this is perhaps the place from Africa that your people were taken from. But he's not. He's an American, and that's his claim. He wants to claim his Americanness, and that's okay too. That he doesn't have to. But he recognizes his African ancestry, but makes his claim on this country, which his ancestors presumably died, sweat, blood, and tears to build.
Yeah.
So there you go. That's where I think I want to end.
Just a little comment. Now, we talked about, Farooq talked about the group called Idol and the rest of them. Now, one thing I observed recently, looking into the diss song that Kendra Lamar did on Drake. So one of the things I've always found a little bit problematic is the fact that, especially like in that song, uh, a good part of it was about questioning Drake's, blackness, you know. And what worries me is that it seems like there are some unseen hands that for some reason they've assumed the role of gatekeepers in deciding who is black enough, who is not black enough, with Barack Obama, uh, with Drake, with this the one that just Kamala Harris and all those kind of things. And I just happen to think that those are one of the things that is a big problem when it comes to unity and all those kind of stuff. What's your take? You think that we need to do more work in terms of, making sure that all those shits we should all we should just like the last speaker talked about, our differences. We have to recognize the unity in that diversity, and that won't be achieved if we continue to, you know, uh, make it, try where we have fault lines, where we tend to magnify those things.
Okay.
I don't know anything about the song, but I would reiterate the last point I just made that, people have a choice about how they want to identify themselves. So it's not my place to tell Morgan Freeman that just because you're Black and of African descent, that you should call yourself an African American and should be engaged in any shape or form with Africa. That's his choice. No more than I can tell Isaiah Washington, who now claims his Africanness, full-heartedly, that he has no right. Because as I said to a Nigerian student of mine, and I'll end there because I do have to run off. As I said to the Nigerian who came to me in class one day and said, she didn't like the way African Americans were appropriating African culture. And I said to you, your job, she was wearing kente and she didn't know what kente meant. I said, it's your job to educate her on what kente means or what this particular thing that she's doing, because she may not know. And I said to her, you cannot appropriate something that once belonged to you. And that's where I ended. Maybe a good place to end here. It was once yours, you can't appropriate something that once belonged to you.
Yes. Yeah, it's exactly 3 o'clock. Thank you so much. Everybody join me in thanking Professor Blyden for a wonderful time of insightful answers and insight. It's just been wonderful. So thank you everyone for listening, for joining us. We've come to the end of this edition of our show. Again, we thank you, Professor Blyden, for a wonderful time. Very insightful.
Thank you all so much. Thank you all, everybody, for coming and for sticking it out for all these hours here. And I hope you all will read my book, and you can send me emails.
Absolutely. And hopefully someday we'll continue this conversation, because I think
thank you so much. Yeah, thanks a lot.
I've already placed my order for the book, and I'll be emailing you with questions. Maybe.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Right. Bye.
Yeah, thanks. Bye. Okay. So that's it.
Okay. Should I end it now?
Yes, you can end it now.
Anyway. Okay. Nobody else has a question, right? Because we could spend like
I don't think so. I don't know. Yeah.
No?
That's it. Yeah.
The guest is gone, so
Yeah, exactly. So just end it now. That's fine. Okay.